Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Cassandra, and I'm really excited to be moderating for today's webinar. I'm joined by Steve Green from Squiz, and today we'll be exploring beyond open tech, how to deliver great digital experiences in less time and cost. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. As usual, today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sending all attendees a link to the recording in the next couple of days. Steve will be presenting, and he'll be also taking questions for about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the presentation. So please submit any questions you may have at the bottom of your screen in the Q&A tab, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. On that note, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. So today I'm joined by Steve Green, Head of Solution Architecture at Squiz. He's responsible for the solution architecture and pre-sales at Squiz, and he's spent the last 10 years in the DXP space working as a solution architect and product manager for personalization platforms. So with that introduction done, I'm going to hand the mic over to Steve Green to begin.
Thanks, Cass. Great. So welcome, everyone. What we're going to talk about today is what does it mean to move beyond Open DXP? But before we can talk about that, we need to kind of unpack a couple of things. So first and foremost, what is a DXP? What does it mean when we talk about it being open DXPs? And then how do we, importantly, move beyond that? So that'll be the agenda we'll be covering. So I guess the first thing with this topic of what is a DXP, I mean, DXP, it stands for Digital Experience Platform. And the most universally accepted thing by what that means is that it's a platform of technologies. So it's a suite of different tools. It's not a point solution, so it's not a single product that you can purchase. But the term itself, although it's used in the technology space, it's not a term that was created by developers. It's a marketing sort of, industry analysts and vendors have arrived at this term. So it can often be a little bit vague sometimes as to what exactly it means. And you can see the definition varies between different organizations. So I thought what would be useful is, first of all, try to kind of laser in on what is a definition of what a DXP is that, encapsulates all of the different vendors that are in this space. One of the interesting things that I think is happening is that there's kind of becoming a meeting of minds between two very different industries. And they're lasering in on something that I think is what a DXP is. So the one that probably everyone is familiar with is the marketing vendors, the MarTech vendors. And you're probably all familiar with customer journeys. So this is something that everyone has been mapping out for the past, 10 or even longer years, 10 or even 20 years. But, in the past 5 years, especially, a lot of different vendors have started saying, okay, well, let's actually build technology around these customer journeys and help companies map them. But then over in the big data space, they've got this concept of business as an event engine that seems to be getting to the same idea, the same underlying idea, but from a very, very different angle, from more of an engineer's approach. And so it's interesting how they're both, without really being involved with each other, coming to the same point, very similar thinking. So one of the analogies I can use here is that of a lemonade stand. If you're in government though, or higher education, or whatever it may be, and you're thinking, well, we're nothing like a lemonade stand, this is just as a generic kind of placeholder for any kind of organization. There's a similar set of problems. We all have something that's equivalent to a customer, whether it's a customer or whether it's a citizen or whether it's a student. It's the same kind of relationship. We're trying to service the different requirements that they have. And we've got all sorts of different points of interaction. So you can imagine for the lemonade stand, they've got everything from advertising, social media, point of sale. They could potentially have a loyalty program. There'll be new offers that, when they invent pink lemonade, they'll be wanting to put out there. And what we've been seeing then, especially, picking up speed every year, is the, digitization of these services. And as they do that, they're kind of planning that around this customer journey mindset. So the customer journey mindset is breaking these points of interaction up into the awareness and intention phase, the investigation and consideration, the actual point of purchase or the point of interaction. So if it's not e-commerce, this would also be where they actually work with that brand or that government organization to achieve something. Then there's a retention process to keep them engaged with that brand or organization, and some sort of potentially loyalty program attached to that as well. And progressively, we're working our way through and digitizing each of these points. So whereas that might have been a physical interaction, so in our lemonade stand example, that now becomes maybe a digital point of sale, or it could be a website where they can go on and transact with the brand directly. If this was government, it would be the digitization of the particular government service that's been offered. So the ability to request your birth certificate online through a web portal rather than having to go in person would be an example of this. And we're working through and digitizing each of these different services one after the other. So each of these yellow dots represents something which was a physical, what you call bricks and mortar interaction, or something which required a lot of manual work and labor, and has now become a digital service where it can be potentially automated, if not in part, then fully. So the simplest way to define what a digital experience is we look at what are all the points that customers interact with. So every point where a customer is directly interacting, they've had an experience with that brand or organization. And that doesn't necessarily have to be an interaction. It could just be literally seeing the brand or being aware of their existence. So even very early on in that awareness phase, they can see, okay, I understand that this company or organization exists. And then from there, we slowly pull them into and be part of what they're doing. Now, the pieces that are digital, that's what we typically refer to then as the digital experience. So the digital experience is a subset of the customer experience. The customer experience is every interaction they're having with you. The digital experience is just the component that has been digitized. And so just to be explicit here, that blue portion there is most likely represented as a website. So this analogy is about a lemonade stand, but you can imagine that the blue piece is actually then something that you're able to do online in a browser. So a DXP most likely is then referred to as being this piece. It's the platform of tools that service the digital experience, with the rest of the customer experience still possibly happening, in person, a physical in-store presence, or someone having to go to, say, the university grounds itself if it was higher education, or they are, having to go to a particular government organization and sit and hold a ticket and wait to be served. So one thing that's happened, one big observation to make about all this is we have to date kind of overinvested, I would say, in the left-hand side of this equation. So if we were to look back and say, what has been the big trends for the past 10 years? It would be that when we've been doing this process of digitization, it is mostly focused on the start of that customer journey. So we've really almost overinvested in the awareness and investigate, consider phases, and then massively underinvested in the rest of the process. And especially the points of interaction which may not be part of the customer experience. So things which the digital experience relies on, but isn't actually exposed to the customer, can often really be falling behind. One of the ways you can see this is often a lot of banks are a really good example of this. So I don't want to name a particular bank, but it's really common to see fantastic banking websites for non-customers. So the front end of the bank is wonderful, credible customer experiences, highly personalized, incredibly well designed, lots and lots and lots of investment in MarTech, so marketing automation and heavy analytics and so on. But then once you actually become a customer, you're stuck with systems that wouldn't look out of place 20 years ago. And even worse, the other big part of this is that you tend to have lots of the different parts of the bank as almost completely separate legal entities. So as a personal example, I sold my apartment, closed off the mortgage, and then 6 months later found out I was still paying for insurance. And when I said to the bank, why was that happening? They said, well, how would we know? we're a completely different arm of the bank, we're a different business. The only way in which we're integrated is at the logo on the top left-hand corner. And that's really telling. That kind of disconnected experience is actually more common than you'd think. So that's the customer journey, the MarTech kind of way of looking at these things. But the other approach that's becoming really interesting is the way that big data is looking at things. So there's various different big data platforms out there, and the way that the kind of thought leadership they're doing, and the thing that they're coming to is this idea of the business as an event engine. So they would say that any organization, whether it be a business or whether it's a higher education or government or whatever industry it might be, can be thought of as an engine that processes a stream of events and then reacts and creates its own events in turn. So you may have a series of events in our hypothetical lemonade stand where we've got an attention event followed by a purchase event that could trigger a restock event. And they can think of the whole organization in that term. Streams of events coming in, they're processed, and new events are then returned back out there. A more concrete example of what this would mean is in a banking system, you could have an event to create the account, an event to deposit money, an event to change the owner, and an event to withdraw. And you can imagine there would be millions of these coming into the banking system at any given time, and they're being processed, and then they're being put back out there. A non-banking example might be something like, for example, with Coles right now, you can go in and you can do your entire purchase experience. In fact, you could do your research before you go to Coles, then you go to the shop and do your entire purchasing experience using the self-checkout system and leave. And there hasn't actually been any face-to-face interaction with that brand at any point. It has, as far as Coles is concerned, been almost essentially a completely digital interaction. Libraries would be another example. So today you can you can search for the books you want to have set aside. You can have them set aside and just have them picked up, so you don't even have to interact with a person. You can, in some areas, have the books delivered to your house. And again, the individual people at the library aren't aware that these interactions are happening. A lot of the time, they are simply looking at a job order saying, please move these books out to the collection area. And they're not aware of who are the individuals collecting them or what are the different experiences that they've had. The library has kind of been set up as this event engine that's just responding to these events that are coming in. And what's interesting is that in the places where this is starting to take off, and banking is really the main area where this has begun, they're starting to mandate this thinking as a way of approaching all new projects. So they're saying, look, anything you want to start, any new business venture, any new approach, it must be built around this model. Because the idea being, if the whole thing is just seen as this series of events and the whole thing is digitized right from the beginning, then scaling it up really becomes more of a technical problem than a personnel problem. So if they want to multiply how many customers they're servicing by 10, they can just simply scale up the infrastructure sitting behind it. They don't then have to hire 10 times as many people. And this is becoming more and more the way they're doing things. They're saying set up things as an event engine rather than as maybe a manual process where there are people involved. So when you take those two ideas and you bring them together, I think that's probably the best definition of what a DXP is. And that's where we've got the customer journey covered. We're able to then digitize a portion of that customer journey. We can have an awareness of how people are interacting with our brand or our organization. And we're also building out these event engines. So we're automating different processes and making it so that if we wanted to scale up a process 10x or 100x, we're really only looking at that as a technical problem. We're not necessarily seeing that as an organizational problem or a personnel problem. Much easier for us to scale. And there's another big benefit of this, which I'll get to soon, which I think we've seen in 2020. So the question then is does open mean anything? If that's what we're meaning by a DXP, so we're referring to it as a platform of tools to service your digital experience and to service these event engines and these automations, what do we mean by open? I think the the kind of misleading thing with this is to say, well, what does closed mean? Before we talk about open, let's have a look at the opposite. And sometimes I think people think that when we're talking about closed, we're saying that these are technologies where they won't allow, the platform won't allow any other third parties. You know, you can't integrate. If we've already made a purchase of another vendor, if we've already got another product we want to work with, they won't allow it. Those don't really work. And to whatever degree, when people do say that, it's kind of like the old gimmick of saying, you know, we've got asbestos-free cereal. No one was really having a problem with that. So saying that it's something that you're leading the charge with doesn't really make any sense. But thankfully, that's not really what they mean. It's more about, does the inclusion of other companies, does the inclusion of other systems, and also that's not just other vendors, but it's also your existing technology investment. So when we're talking about these DXP platforms, we've importantly got to allow for also the systems that you've already invested in heavily. Is there a strategy to include those? Is there an openness there to make sure that they're part of the equation? And I think that's where the meaning of open comes into this, is there actually a strategy to enable them as well? And at a technical level, obviously open means open APIs. So the ability to make sure that the functionality of the system is something that can be integrated with those other systems. You can pull in the capabilities of your existing investments into the kind of digital experiences you're creating, and you can make the whole system work as a cohesive whole. So you don't have that banking example I gave before where you've got a veneer of a great customer experience, but once they actually become a customer, they very quickly find out that, okay, this isn't going to work. This is actually a series of completely separate services. So there are really 3 types of DXP platforms out in the market at the moment. And this is probably the 3 types that there have been for the past 10 years, and they'll probably continue to be the 3 types of DXP platforms that we'll continue to have. So the first is the acquisition-focused DXP platforms. So these are big, deep-pocketed organizations, big global brands that have the purchasing power to essentially acquire one of each product. So they're going to go out, they'll acquire all the different vendors in say, the marketing space, and they will then offer that in a gift basket that can be purchased in a single procurement process. So the pro of this is that at the time of acquisition, and it typically continues, but not necessarily, but certainly at the time of acquisition, they're usually the market leaders. The con is that because they're buying the biggest platform for each of the different products, so if they'll go buy, say, a marketing automation vendor, or they go buy an analytics platform, at the time of acquisition, since those were the market leaders, they also tend to be the most complex platforms. And so there's usually an expectation before the acquisition that implementing those products would have been a project in its own right. So if you were going to go implement one of these, say, marketing automation platforms, you'd set aside a project manager and a development team, and you'd gather requirements. When you bring it all together into a platform, suddenly the expectations change that you're implementing the platform in one go. And that's where typically people trip up. And what they find is that once they've spent the budget purchasing this platform of tools, they've only got enough left over to then implement one of them. And it's usually the base CMS. So they stand up the website, and then they've got an overpurchase of software. And this is a problem which Gartner and Forrester have both called out as an issue over the past 10 years, is overpurchasing of software is a huge problem. Something like billions of dollars annually are spent on products that are never used. The other type of DXP is the own brand vendor. So this is where the company, they won't have as deep the pockets of the acquisition vendors. They're not able to go out and acquire a lot of different platforms, but they have tried to build all of them themselves. But you can imagine their research and development budgets then have spread very, very thin. So the pro is that you have one procurement process to buy the whole lot. Your downside is that because the research and development budgets are spread so thin, there is an expectation that you have an internal development team to be active. And if you have that internal development team, then they can kind of shore up any shortcomings that might be in these products. But if you don't, then you're going to be heavily relying on wherever that development is going to be coming from. So you'll have to be turning to somewhere to get those developers, because on their own, out of the box, those products are not necessarily going to be, workable. The last one is the organizations that focus on digital services. So this is where they focus on, tooling and systems, low-code systems, integration systems that help organizations meet their digital experience requirements. The downside is that they leave their customers to form their own marketing stack, which 10 years ago was terrifying. And you'd see these slides shown regularly of, look at all these thousands of marketing technology vendors out there, and you're going to have to navigate this yourself, and this is impossible. And I think that's what kind of was really compelling with DXPs at the beginning was, okay, this is a vendor who's going to do all this for me. But I think nowadays, with the way that the market has consolidated and with the enormous amount of material you can find online about forming marketing stacks and integrating marketing stacks, I think this is now much less of a problem. You see interesting things like the Stackies Awards, where you'll see different marketing teams actually showing off how well they've put together their marketing stack and how well they've kind of brought it together. So I don't think it's quite the terrifying prospect that it used to be. So those are the different types of vendors that are out there in the space. They all broadly will have the ability to have third-party vendors come into this and be part of these systems. But typically that's seen as a developer problem. Open typically is only ever meant you're open. It's almost a euphemism for we're open for you to get developers to fix stuff. And the APIs are there. The APIs on their own aren't going to help you, especially if you're not a developer. So that then comes to the question of how do we move beyond just saying open? The move beyond open, it's becoming really pressing. I think that in making greater use of your existing technology investments has become something that's gone from being a hypothetical, we probably should be doing this, to suddenly in 2020 being the only thing that I think everyone's thinking about. If we go back to our lemonade stand example, what we've found in 2020 is suddenly all of the points that we hadn't digitized, everything where the overlap of the digital experience didn't fully overlap with the full customer experience, has just simply shut down, or for at least a period of time has shut down. And the dotted lines on either side, that's where it kind of goes outside of your organization. So we're talking about the digitization of, say, other companies and organizations we rely on. What we've often found from a supply chain standpoint is we may have done a great job. Our services have been digitized. We've got this business engine running, but all the systems sitting behind that and our different vendors and providers, they weren't. And so the whole thing has fallen apart there as well. And again, we've had that overinvestment in the attention and the marketing side of the equation. So we've seen what a lot of organizations have done, both commercial and government, is when they were thinking about digital, they've mainly only thought about the websites. And when they think about websites, they say, well, that's marketing's problem. And so they hand the whole problem over to marketing, which is fairly unfair to them, and say, here you go, solve this problem, when really it's a whole of organization problem. The entirety of the organization has the ability to be digitized. And this can lead then to that customer experience, which is then much more resilient to the kind of shocks we're seeing in the market right now in 2020. So how do we break this problem down? So we've got these platforms of tools that we want to bring in to build these digital experiences, whether it be websites or mobile apps or chatbots. There's all sorts of different channels and experiences we can deliver. We've got a lot of different tools that we could purchase. We've got a lot of existing investments that we've already made. Is there a strategy we can do to kind of break this up into pieces to help us form what our digital experience platform looks like? Because an important point here is, yes, there are vendors that refer to themselves as DXP vendors, but the DXP you end up with is not the product that you're buying from the vendor. It's the end result of their products plus all of the investments you've already made. So your CRM is part of your DXP. You know, your analytics platform that you've already maybe purchased is part of your DXP. So when we're dealing with both these new products that we're going to be bringing in and the existing investments we've made, how do we rationalize all that and make decisions around how we're going to progress? And the best way to do that is to really just break it up into three types of challenges. So we've got universal challenges. So we've got problems which they're the same problems no matter what you are. So if you're, you know, commercial, if you're government, if you're higher education, whatever it may be, whatever vertical you're in, you're going to face the same kind of challenge as each other. And a great example of this would be analytics. So the kind of analytics challenges that you are facing are the same as the analytics challenges that anyone else on this webinar right now are facing. It's the same underlying technical problem that you're trying to solve. And so for that, for universal problems, always go with online, cloud-based, SaaS, best-of-breed vendors. And the reason for that is simple. It's because there are so many people with the same problem, those people are going to smooth off all the rough edges. Every possible problem you could think of or have had, someone else has had it, and not just someone, potentially hundreds of people have had it. And so the net effect of this is that they wear down all of those issues. So although you have less ability to customize or develop on top of these platforms, and a concrete example of what I'm talking about here would be Google Analytics. Google Analytics may not do everything that you're wanting to do, and it may not accommodate the edge case problems that you've got, but the core of it, 99% of what it is you're trying to do, it's going to do it incredibly well, because there's literally thousands of organizations that are using it in every possible way. And so again, they smooth off any of the rough edges that are there. For industry problems, so if something's unique to your industry, you know, it's only a problem that is in the industry you work in, then go with industry vendors. There's nothing wrong going with some company that may seem a little bit pokey in some areas, but they're focused on your industry for solving a particular problem. You know, this would be mainly because of regulatory and compliance reasons. So if they understand your industry, then they're going to be aware of the regulations, the compliance problems that you've already got. They've already done the heavy lifting. They've gone through with a fine-tooth comb all the all of the legal side of things as well. And so an example of this again would be One Council ERP for local government, Moodle for higher education. If it was a library, it would be the checkout system that they use. You know, everyone probably can think of different tools that are unique to their industry. And the solution for them is integration. So the areas that they're weak in, you can mask. So the areas they're strong in, you want to bring those strengths to the rest of that digital experience platform. So if you've got, let's use the libraries as an example. If you've got a system that tracks where the books are and whether they've been checked out, let's say the website that system stands up is poor, which is pretty normal. Because they're focusing their research and development budgets on the core problem they're trying to solve, the rest of the other things they're trying to do tend to be very kind of thin and flaky. So they may find that it does a great job of keeping track of which books are checked out and who's got them and what they're going to be reading next. But the website is very poor, then integrate it with a CMS or integrate it with some other digital platform that you've already got. The integration is the solution to most of the shortcomings in these industry platforms. And then lastly, if there's something unique to you, so if there's something about your organization or you're a government department and you're the only one that looks after a particular area, or another way of looking at it is if you need to innovate. If there's an innovation problem that you have, build it. Don't go out to market and find, you know, a tool and try to build the solution using some kind of off-the-shelf tool. Build it. It's you know, we've been told for quite a while now that every organization is a software company, and I know it certainly doesn't feel like that. You know, we're not all Facebook and Google. We don't have those kind of offices, but that option is always there. And there have been some big changes in this space that have made it much, much easier for every organization to innovate. And we'll go into that in a second. But if I tackle each of these three problems, each of these then has a recommendation we can make, or there's been a change in the market that we can speak to that helps us move beyond just open. So if just open is, okay, the platform is there, it has these APIs, it has these abilities to integrate, we have all these different suites of tools, what can we do with them to move beyond just this? And move beyond it just being seen as maybe developer problems. What are the different techniques we can make use of? I think the first one isn't really a technology or a technique. It's simply the mastery of these tools. So when you're dealing with these universal problems, so when you're dealing with things like Google Analytics, for example, don't focus so much on the shortcomings of these tools until you feel like you've really mastered the tool. It's incredibly common for organizations to be looking at purchase decisions, to be looking at making a big change without really understanding the tool that they're leaving. So there may be one thing that it doesn't do or they're struggling with, but if the rest of the tool is working incredibly effectively, it might not be worth moving just because of that one problem. And likewise, if you're going to move from one tool with less capabilities to a tool with more capabilities, and you're not a master of the first tool, then you really don't stand much of a chance of getting mastery over the tool that you're moving to. So mastery of the tools is actually a much bigger problem than the tool's functionality themselves. And I think a really good way to highlight this is to look at really big organizations that we're probably all familiar with who use tools that are often seen as mid-market tools or bottom end of the market tools. And as an example, Bunnings just runs on Google Analytics. They haven't made a massive investment in analytics. JB Hi-Fi is on Shopify, which I think a lot of people would be shocked by. Vodafone uses MailChimp. They haven't made a massive investment in some, touted as massive enterprise-grade mail system. They just use MailChimp. They use it incredibly effectively. They understand back to front how it works, and they know its shortcomings, but they get more use out of that because they've mastered the use of that tool. They know exactly how it behaves. So the other kind of approach we can take, the other solution is for industry problems is integration. So you've got these systems, they're shared by other organizations in your industry. They are strong in the area where you need them to be strong. So they're strong on, servicing the unique kind of things that your industry has, the compliance and regulation requirements, but they're very weak on everything else. They either completely lack some functionality that you need, or the functionality that they do have looks very dated. So a really common thing being the web portals, for example. The other problem is that you'll often have multiple of these industry tools. So you may have 3 or 4 different things that are for your industry, and you're having your users log into them each individually. So each of them is standing up some kind of portal or digital experience. Your customers, your citizens, your students, whoever they may be, they're coming in and they're having a series of disconnected experiences with these different industry tools. There's nothing wrong with the tools. The tools are doing their job, but the experiences they're giving to these people is very poor. So as an example, in higher education, you may have Canvas, Oracle, Workday, Salesforce, and your students would be interacting with all 4 of those in 4 different ways, and none of those 4 tools could know about each other. And Gartner sums this up pretty neatly. They've said just recently, last year, 85% of the effort and cost in a DXP platform is going to be spent on integrations. And importantly, those integrations, they're internal and external systems, but they're even often with the DXP's own functionality. So it's kind of often overstated the degree to which a DXP's platform's different systems work with each other. Yeah, and so this is a really common problem. The big change that's happened in the market is the rise of integrations as a service platforms. So these are tools that make integration massively cheaper. It's run in the cloud, it's a platform. It also visualizes these integrations. So it's possible for people who aren't developers to see how are all the pieces connected together. It provides a level of quality control and maintainability with these integrations. And importantly, it makes it possible for developers to work much, much faster. It also enables technically minded people who aren't developers to create integrations. And I think that's another really important thing we're going to see over this decade. So yes, we're going to see the rise of low code enabling greater productivity in developers, but I think we're also going to see people who aren't developers, but you know what, they've taken some some development courses, they know what a REST service is, they consider themselves to be a whiz with something like Marketo or some other complex tools, and they're not afraid to get in and actually try to kind of create these systems themselves, maybe with a bit of support from developers. That's where these tools have really risen, is the ability to enable, to democratize a lot of this functionality. And once it's working, you can then have the industry specific tools delivering what they're good at, but then they're integrated with, say, a CMS or a DXP platform that brings that together into a single digital experience, which is at a much, much higher level than what it's servicing out of the box. The third big change we've seen is the rise of low code and microservices. So you've got a unique problem. It's just your organization that has it. Now, it's either unique because you're unique, there's something about you that no other organization has, or you're looking to innovate. So you're looking to create something unique, you're looking to differentiate yourself. Again, we're all being told that every organization is a software company, but developers are prohibitively expensive. And I think there's always been this hope that one day the rates will come down and it'll be more affordable. And the reason why that hasn't happened, and it probably never will happen for most of the development we're looking to do, is simply because whenever you can get a developer in 1 hour of work to save 2 hours of work for someone else, developers will never be cheap. They're inherently going to be expensive just because they're delivering so much value potentially back to organizations. So what we need to move the focus from is not start worrying so much about the cost of developers, but about getting more out of them. So there's the first one then really is low code. Now this is in running counter to another movement, which is no code. No code is the idea that you can build these applications yourself. You won't need a developer at all. As a technically minded person, you can go in, drag and drop tools, build these up. I'm not alone in being very dubious of that, mainly because we've already been down this road. So if we go way back to the 90s, we saw no-code platforms back then. So we had Microsoft Access, and you could drag and drop features and buttons and components onto a page, and you could build out these applications yourself. And then we spent all of the 2000s ripping those systems back out again. Because developers don't just write code, they're also engineers, and they're architects, and they build things that are supposed to be maintainable and structured in ways that are simple for the organization to then maintain and update. No code platforms, they don't do that. So they're mostly going to write yourself into a quarter. The difference then with low code is just about productivity. It's about getting more out of less developer time, allowing them to use tools that really speed up what they're able to achieve. The other big change is microservices. So if you're going to build something yourself, there's some unique digital service you want to create. Way back when, we're going way back in time now, 1990s, it's what you'd call spaghetti code. So it's an unmanageable mess of code, sort of like a Rube Goldberg machine, all kind of connected together. It kind of runs once and then falls apart. In the 2000s, we moved to what we can jokingly call lasagna architecture. So we had layers of systems. So we had our database backend, then we had our middleware, and then we had our front end. And we could kind of sanitize things that way and have everything separated. But where we've been since last decade and all the way through to this decade, it's probably going to be the approach we take is what we now call microservices. And this is where you create services that do just one thing, and they're able to scale that up. So if, let's say, we take logging in, so we've got authentication. We take authentication out, we treat it as a microservice, stands alone. And if we want to authenticate one person per day or 1 million people per day, we can scale that system quite easily, but it's a shared microservice across all the different tools we're using. So I know a lot of you may have been just listening to this and thinking, oh, geez, I've been stuck here listening to a developer. I apologize. But if you talk to someone and say, can we use microservices as a way to make this, this development, this custom development we're trying to do cheaper? The answer is probably going to be yes. Microservices simplify a lot of what you're trying to do by breaking the problem up into its small pieces. And you end up with what they're calling here ravioli architecture, lots of little tasty pieces. So that's the big change that I think for when you're looking to solve a unique problem for you, or you're looking to innovate, both of these technologies have made developers much more productive and what they're creating much more reliable. And I think that's really made the promise of, oh, we're all technology companies now true. I think it's much more approachable for organizations to innovate without putting a lot of money into something that when they compare it against something comparable in the market, they feel like they're light years behind. Instead, they'll feel like they're actually able to deliver things that their users will feel is roughly what they'd expect in the market from any other platform. So those are the three approaches that we're recommending. So break the problem up into what's universal, what's in your industry, what's unique, and then you've got these three different approaches to try to solve that. And that's really how we move beyond open. That's how we go beyond just saying, oh, it's got APIs, it's open, best of breed, good luck with that, go get the developers. These are approaches we can take to rationalize that, to break it up into some pieces and actually make the most effective use of it. And so with that, I'll move then on to who we are. And I've left this on purpose to last. We're Squiz. So for those who don't know, Squiz has been recognized as by the world's biggest analysts, so Gartner and Omdia. We're one of the leading DXP vendors out there. And we help organizations keep pace with all of these customer expectations. So we've constantly got this inflation of what the customer and what the student and what the citizen is expecting from us. And Squiz's DXP platform helps organizations keep pace with that and lead those expectations as well. We've been doing it for about 21 years now globally. Our headquarters are here in Australia, and we have offices around the world. So we're based in the States, the UK, globally. And the sectors that we deal with are across a variety of sectors. So government, financial services, and higher education are some of the focuses for us. We've been well recognized by the different analysts. So Gartner, we're placed in the Gartner Magic Quadrant. We're listed for critical capabilities for digital experience platforms, and Omdia has recognized us as one of the leading platforms as well. We've got a variety of different customers across the US, UK, and ANZ, and again across private, government, and higher education. The platform itself, the biggest difference between our approach to this and other vendors in the space really is when we were looking before at the different type of vendors, the acquisitional ones, the kind of home brand, build everything themselves ones, we're much more focused on digital services. We're focused on really the rest of the problem. So if the focus from DXP is mainly being on the marketing stack, we largely see that as, if not a solved problem, then certainly an area where there's been enough investment already. So there's literally billions of dollars flowing into these problems. They're largely universal problems. So they're the same problem shared across all organizations. There has been problems with integrating them, but we think that problem is now solved. And so it's not an area where we need to enter that space and try to solve problems, because it's not really problems that our customers are having. Our focus is much more on the rest of the issues. So if we come back to that lemonade stand example, it's all the other dots in the equation, and especially the ones that this year turned red and went offline. We're looking to digitize the whole of the business so that we can both digitize the whole customer journey, but we can also create those event engines that try to automate as much of the organization as possible. So the digital experience platform we provide, it's running on our Experience Cloud. So these are all cloud-based products. And we have the Squiz Matrix content management system. We have Funnelback for search and analytics. Connect is our integration platform. So that's our integration as a service, cloud-based integration platform. And Data Store, which is our low-code offering to help speed up developers, which is our data service. And the way this then maps to that problem earlier is that the Squiz matrix is then the foundational service that those universal tools go onto. So when you get things like Google Analytics or Optimizely, or whatever it may be that you've formed as your marketing stack, all of those tools will run on Matrix. So Matrix goes out of its way to make sure it integrates and supports those platforms. And it's not just at an API level, not just at a open means go get the developers, but there is a marketplace of tooling and integrations there to help bring all those systems in. From the industry specific piece of the problem, then that's where the integration is the most important. So the integration, meaning we can take multiple different platforms. So it's not usually just one, it's often as many as 4 different platforms that are specific to your industry, and then bring those together into a single digital experience that people are able to work with. Importantly, we also have Funnelback, and that's then searching across all of these different platforms as well. So you have a federated search solution that can find information no matter where it's stored. So we can we can merge those different data silos. And lastly, from the unique standpoint, we have tools like Data Store. So these are low-code tools that massively speed up developers. So often when you're doing development, you may go to the developers, you explain what it is you're trying to solve, and they say, great, we'll get onto it. We're going to work on a series of sprints. So you come back in 2 weeks' time, say, how's it going? And they say, oh, it's great. We've decided what the database is going to be. Okay. So you come back 2 weeks' time, how's it going? Oh yeah, it's great. We've decided that we're going to put it on this particular cloud server, and this is where we're going to build the APIs, and so on and so on. You keep coming back, and at no point do you actually get to see the functionality that you're wanting to give feedback on. It's agile, but without that ability to feed back, if it's purely just working on pouring the concrete and laying the foundations, a lot of your agile projects is just spent waiting. Data Store is about narrowing that, setting up the foundations process down from, say, 6 to 8 weeks down to 2 to 3 days, really collapsing it down by allowing developers to write out the description of the problem they're trying to solve essentially in a blueprint, and then automate all of those processes. So all of the processes of setting up the servers and setting up the APIs and securing them, it's all automated for you. And that's me. So I guess it's probably time for questions.
Cool. Thanks, Steve. Let's begin the Q&A part of this session. If you have any questions for Steve, please pop them into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. But I'll get started on one of the first ones that's come in from Anna. Where can organizations start, Steve?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the best thing to do is to not necessarily treat it as, so we often talk about digital transformation as a thing, and that's often perceived to be a wipe the slate clean and start again kind of approach. I think that's probably not the best approach, because typically all that happens is that there is more work then done on the planning, and all the effort and budget is spent kind of planning what this massive digital transformation would look like, and then almost nothing is left to actually realize it. So the best thing to do is make it an iterative process. Only make those big leaps when you've run out of steam, when you really can't go any further with a series of iterative steps. Be kind of cautious and sort of a little bit, make sure you're taking it with a pinch of salt when there is a recommendation to do a full rip and replace, especially of anything where you've already made heavy investments.
Cool. We also have another question from John. What role does personalization play in this?
Yeah, I mean, personalization is, and this is going to sound like you've probably all heard it before, is it's going to be one of the most important things over the next 10 years, but it's not going to bear any resemblance to how it's being visualized today. So there is a type of tool out there, it's a marketing tool called a conversion optimization tool. Optimizely is the market leader in this space. And this is where, Google, for example, may have, no, not Google, but any company may have a button, a buy now button. And you want to try every variation of that, whether it's, what gives you the most clicks on that? Is it whether it's teal or whether it's blue or whether it's green or whether it's, it says buy now or buy later or whatever it may be. You want to go through every variation and see which one gives you the best outcomes. And these are often also seen as these kind of rule builder systems. If you're in Melbourne, then show this banner. Those personalization engines, they're good at solving that one problem, but over the past 10 years, they've kind of been missold as a personalization solution. And if you want to see kind of where the market is now at, where the thinking is at, have a look at Gartner's hype cycle for where they're placing personalization engines. Personalization, to be done right, has to be done as part of the initial design, has to be built in really low at a functional level of the digital experience. The analogy being that when you look at, or as always, turn to a car analogy. If you look at Tesla, if I had a Tesla, I don't, I wish I did. If I walk towards it with my key, it'll recognize that it's me. It'll change the position of the seats. It'll switch the radio station to my favorite. It'll move the mirrors. That's personalization. But when you think about how that's achieved, it has to happen at a very low level. They had to have thought about that from the moment they started designing that car, because it needs some fundamental changes as to how the car behaves at a deep level. So a lot of the time has been wasted over the past 10 years by trying to find personalization fixes that are kind of like a coat of paint. They can be slapped on afterwards, and you can have that, if from Melbourne, then change the banner ad. The problem is that we could probably dedicate a whole other talk to why personalization engines are not suited for that problem. It hasn't resulted in anything. So we've seen 10 years of that being promised as the solution, and it doesn't work. If we're going to do personalization, it has to be at a very low functional level. It has to change the behavior of the site, and that means you have to start it as part of the initial design. You can't do it as a phase 2, but it's vital. I mean, it's just expected now.
Okay, we have a question here from Gina. We use multiple platforms, but the biggest problem we are facing is the connection/interface, and the real problem preventing the organization to implement the interfaces and start making connections is data security and privacy concerns. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so until you said those last few words, I would have said integration. So setting aside the compliance part of it, integration is the way to go. So integration is the way that you can bring those points together, but then data security and compliance is the place where that becomes tricky. And so that's where you need to just be careful during the initial evaluation that from a data sovereignty and security point, you've got everything ticked. The important thing is two things. Is the requirements just around, is it around data at rest or data in transit? So sometimes it's only data at rest, and data at rest means where it's stored. So a lot of the time with integration, you can fix the problem by connecting sort of all the plumbing together, but having it all leading back to the same central place. So you've got, for example, your customer record, which is living in Salesforce. You're happy with that, that's secure, that ticks your compliance boxes. But the information used in that record is then powering lots of different systems. And the integration platform is then moving that information between those systems, but it doesn't persist in those systems. It doesn't stay at rest. That can then be fine. It's only when it's data at transit becomes a problem, but often that's not the case. It's often almost always just data at rest that's the issue. However, there's still compliance issues there. But the other big part of this is, I think organizations, they're often very uneven with their requirements. So if you look at your requirements and then try to apply it to what you've already got. So a really common example is, we can't have any system hosted outside of Australia, which, for government especially, that's a real problem. But then if you look at the website they're currently running, you'll see that they're running 3 or 4 different products that are hosted outside of Australia. And when you go back to them and say, well, why is this the exception? You'll often find that, the marketing team isn't willing to give up that product, but the IT team isn't willing to, accommodate it. And I think this is where the two need to come together and say, well, are these rules as quite as hard and fast as we've been saying? Are they as strict as we're saying? Or can we find exceptions, or can we find ways of reworking them so that they're more up to speed with cloud, modern cloud vendors?
Gina's just responded again. She said, it is also related to different legislations, geographic, diverse. Example, our headquarters is in is in Europe, which is very strict compliance, but in ANZ and US, it's more relaxed, and you are right on the exemption part. Thank you, Steve.
Great. Yeah, GDPR is then a great example of that, where in Europe it's iron fast, and then here in Australia it doesn't have any legal weight. Yeah.
Cool, and we got time for maybe one more question from Keith. How do I know a DXP is an appropriate solution for our organization?
I think okay, that's an interesting one. How do we know it's appropriate? I think it's appropriate if you can match the products in the platform to a strategy. So it can be really easy to kind of see it as a technology shopping spree. You're going out there and you're going to buy a bit of everything, and it's all going to be fantastic. But if you can't map that variety of tools back to some kind of guiding strategy, then your most likely mistake you're going to make with the DXP won't be so much that you pick the wrong one, but that you buy too much software. Because they're all, the P in it is always platform. So that means many different products. You see time and time again, I absolutely, over the past 10 years, I cannot keep count of how many times I've seen this. Organizations that will buy every single product, they put sometimes as much as 50% of their budget towards that, and that leaves them with nothing left over to actually use those products. So software over purchase is probably the biggest problem. That's what will guide what's the right DXP for you. You want to make sure that all of the products that you are going to buy are mapping to some kind of strategy of what it is you're wanting to accomplish.
Cool. Looks like we're out of time for any more questions. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you again, Steve, for the fantastic presentation. Just a quick reminder, we'll be sending through today's recording and the slides within the next couple of days. In the meantime, if you're interested in learning more about Squiz's DXP, we'd love to hear from you. And thanks again for joining, and please enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Great. Thanks, everyone.